And she said, you'd be better off if he beat the crap out of you every day.
This is Detra, take 1, camera A, mark.
I was born to a pastor and his wife in Arkansas, and we were always at very small churches. Some of them I would even call podunk churches, Arkansas language there. But at the age of 4, my dad stood me in a chair behind the pulpit and told me to sing. And I got out the first, sentence of the hymn and then just laid over on the pulpit and bawled my eyes out, so he had to finish it. But that kind of began my emotional journey with music. And I continued in the church, through the years, sang in choir, sang specials, taught classes, ran a bus route, and, just did general errands as a pastor's daughter. It's one of the few careers that I know of that you are part of the package deal. There's no money for you, but you have to be good, be sweet, be quiet, And so I was part of the package deal. And honestly, I loved the package. I'm the oldest of 4 kids. And so I went to college and, as it happens a lot, I fell in love my 3rd year and got married. And I married a pastor. And his dad was a pastor. So it was kind of all I knew, inner circle ministry. It was a small Baptist group, much smaller than the Southern Baptists, which you hear about in the news a lot. And so we got married, and in 3 weeks, I knew that I wanted out, which I didn't understand. I wasn't expecting that. To me, marriage, you commit this vow, you commit to this person till death do you part. This is serious. And I never expected to have that feeling at all. And at 3 weeks of being married, it wasn't just a little feeling. It was like, I've got to call my dad to come get me. It was that kind of desperate feeling. And I was doing our laundry. We lived in this little 1-bedroom government subsidized apartment. And I remember putting our laundry in the basket on my hip with the detergent and walking over to the central area where the laundromat was. And I fought this out in my mind, It was this fierce feeling inside that I had to get away, that I had to leave, and that I had to call for help. And it didn't fit the paradigm with which I had been raised, which was, the girl has to obey the authority, her dad, and then when she marries, she has to obey the authority of her husband. And this was serious, and I'd been drawn charts, that the husband's the head of the home, and I'm under him, and if I get out from under that umbrella, then God will not protect me, nor will he bless me. God would love me, but he wouldn't protect me or bless me. And I took this seriously, and I was taught with these charts that if I wanted to be a godly woman, I had to follow this. And I couldn't do anything without getting the permission of my authority. And if he didn't bless it and give me permission, then I wasn't allowed to do it. So that was my life. And I will say I didn't have problems with any of that, until I've been married 3 weeks and I wanted out. So as I'm doing the laundry and I'm fighting this out in my heart and my mind, I recalled my dad telling me several times when I was a teenager, when you get married, Detra, you got to marry somebody that can conquer you, because you're too strong. Now, I am a firstborn, and I am strong, but I never rebelled a day in my life. I didn't rebel. Did I do things? And my dad spanked us, and it was never beatings or anything, but, I got spankings. Yeah, I did. But most of the time when I'd do something, I'd run tell him, because I couldn't stand, thinking that he might be mad at me or something. So I wasn't rebellious. I wasn't kicking against authority. If anything, I bent over backwards to make authority happy. So remembering in my mind, Dad telling me that several times, I thought, well, my dad's right. I believed everything my dad said, and I'm just prideful. That's the problem. I'm prideful. So I just need to submit and be the kind of wife that he needs. Okay, this isn't what I thought it was going to be, but, this is my husband. And then I remembered my mom. The week before I married, And I assure you, my mom meant well. She did. And she said, Detra, marriage is forever. And just so you know that, if there's any trouble between the two of you, we'll take him, but we won't take you. And that kind of sealed the deal, with my fight that day doing the laundry is, I'm going to have to rethink marriage and, how to get through this because I'm prideful. And besides, if I call, they're not going to take me. So I spent 32 and a half years, giving it all I had. Did I make mistakes? Just one. No, I made plenty of mistakes. I made mistakes. But I thought if you forgive enough and if you love hard enough, that someone will love you. And that never happened, That never happened. I had 7 children, so that did keep me occupied. I was a pastor's wife, and that kept me occupied. So for the most part, even though I was struggling internally, I still thought it's just me. And occasionally we would run across these moments where, I don't know if you remember the old Polaroid cameras where you take this snapshot and you watch it develop, but I would take these Polaroid snapshots of these moments of my marriage, and I would kind of save it and tuck it away in my mind, and I would think, there's something wrong with this picture. But I could not figure out what it was. And so having the 7 children, I home educated my children, pastor's wife. I mean, there's always something to do, occupy my mind. And I just thought it's going to get better. And I really, as I would get to moments where I think, I've got to get away. I've got to run away from him. I had 7 kids. I didn't have a job. I couldn't do it, And as is my habit, I'd go to my bedroom, close the door, and get on my knees. And I would say, God, I don't know how I'm going to stay here with him. I don't want him to touch me. I don't know how I'm going to get in bed with him. You're going to have to help me, because my heart right now, I can't do this. But somehow, I would get better. And if you look up abuse and you know about abuse, and I only knew about someone hitting you, so I didn't know about the rest of it. There's a pattern, They know when they've gone too far, and then they love bomb you and tell you they can't live without you, and, all those kinds of bullshit. And in reality, you think you're crazy. You're torn to shreds. You think about killing yourself. You think I can't live much longer. You worry that, you're going to be a bad example. You worry that you're going to hurt the name of Christ if you leave. I mean, all those things. At the bottom of it, though, is this hope that one day I'm going to say the right thing, and he's going to figure out how mean he is to me, and he will be so sorry. And he'll love me. "32 and a half years into our marriage, I finally decided I would go talk to somebody. I'd never told anybody about my marriage. And I tried with every fiber of my being to find ways to get through to him. And I begged him for 30 years to go get help. And nothing worked. In fact, one night, we'd gotten to one of these Polaroid snapshot moments, and I was beside myself. It was just, I can't do this any longer. And I had, I'm the type, I read all the Nancy Drew books, the Hardy Boy books, the Bobbsey twins, the Trixie Belden. I read them all, Boxcar Children. I was going to solve this mystery. And that night, out of desperation, I went to him, and for the first time, I said, something in you wants me dead. We're at a place in our marriage, we're here all the time, and I don't know what it is, but something in you wants me dead. And from his 6'6" height, he didn't bat an eyelash. He looked down at me and he said, "You're right. Something in me wants you dead." I should have been shocked at this, and this should have scared me. Instead, it was like I was Nancy Drew and I found a clue and I was going to solve the mystery, you know? And it was a little bit of relief that I'm just not crazy. He really does want me dead. And determined to get the answer to and get another clue, I was sobbing and I was like, but why? Why do you want me dead? He said, I don't know. It just wants you dead. I don't know who to be more shocked at, him for not batting an eyelash or caring for revealing that, or me, the woman who stayed another 6, 7, 8 years. I don't know. I still thought with that revelation, he might, figure out that our marriage wasn't going best. And actually, on his side, it was. Good old Detra did whatever it took. Good old Detra fixed. Good old Detra cleaned up. Good old Detra kept forgiving. Good old Detra kept loving. And he just kept on. So I went and talked to somebody after 32 and a half years. And she had helped me kind of work on some of my childhood trauma. I don't talk about my childhood trauma a lot, but behind my parents' back, my parents knew nothing of this. There was a group of men who started on me when I was 2 years old. So by the time I was 9, I had had encounters with groups of men more than once. I will leave that to your imagination. So I was well versed in putting on a smile and trying to figure out. And I had talked with her about, this childhood stuff, and I had worked diligently for years because I am determined not to be held captive by things that people put into your life that you don't want and that you didn't have a choice about. But it's hard work. I'd never talked to her about my marriage, and so I told her, I said, look, I need to talk about this. And I even told her, I have some Polaroid snapshots. Now, these aren't real Polaroid snapshots, but they're mental, and I'd collected so many, and I talked about them. And she had a question for me. She said, if he was beating you, would you leave him? And I said, well, of course I would. And she said, you'd be better off if he beat the crap out of you every day. It's one of those moments in my life that I call a light bulb moment, and it was like this 1,000-watt light bulb went off, and I could see all the broken bones and the bruises inside of me that I'd been feeling since I was married 3 weeks, but nobody could see. And suddenly I saw them. She said, in fact, you'd be better off if he beat the crap out of you every day. And part of me thinks that's true, because I would have had proof. I would have had something visual, and I'm a very visual person, and I didn't have any visuals, But when she said it, I knew it was true. So I got back in my car to go home, and I knew exactly how I was going to handle it. We sat down together, and I told him, I owe you an apology. I thought all these years I was being a good wife. Yeah, I have my quirks, and I said, but I thought I was being a good wife. I was being submissive, and I was forgiving and loving, but I've realized I've enabled. And that's not being a good wife. And I'm sorry. I'm really sorry that I've not been a good wife. And I said, so here's the deal. From this day forward, I'm not going to enable. I've begged you over 30 years to get help, and I've done everything I know to do. This is now up to you. And how I did a visual for him is I said, if our marriage is an island, we've had lots of storms, and I always clean up after the storm. I make sure everything's okay. I said, but this time a tsunami has hit the island, and I'm out in the water. And here's the deal. I'm not doing a thing. I'm not doing one thing to clean this up, make sure the island's there. It's all up to you. But I want to tell you, I'm out in the water. And I began to have boundaries. Well, I learned with this type of personality, you don't do that, and things got worse. So I called in an interventionist and a mediator, which I've never known of anyone to do, but I was desperate, you know. I made this vow till death do us part, and I just knew somehow it was going to work out. The interventionist and mediator were both horrified, and forcibly confronted him. And I watched him win them over. He won them over. I went to see my doctor one day. He's not kind of your normal doctor. He does things kind of outside the box. And I told him a little bit about what was going on. And I told him that I was asking God to kill me so nobody would know. I didn't want my children to know. I didn't want my parents to know. I didn't want any of the people at all the churches we had been to know. I didn't want anybody to know, because if they knew, I felt like it would hurt the name of God. As if God needs help protecting his name. But I was going to do everything I could to make sure his name wasn't hurt. And my doctor said, you need to change your prayer. And I was startled, and I was like, well, why? He said, because your body hears you. And my health was terrible. In fact, if we were out, I had to be in a wheelchair sometimes. If we went to the mall, my two older boys the van would be pulled up to the curb, and they would get out, help me walk to the closest bench. The family would shop, they would walk me to the curb, the van would pick me up. It was really bad. And I said, well, my body is dying. And he said, change your prayer. Honestly, I thought it was a pretty good prayer. I had rationalized everything and figured out this would solve everything if I was dead. So I just told God, hey, I do know my body does hear, and I do know I'm dying. So here's what I have to ask, in your omniscience, in your omnipotence, if there's another way, would you give me a clue? And I talked with the pastor and his wife, and I talked to 3 people who had been married over 20 years. Nobody's divorced, and all 3 of them said, you got to get away from him. Now, this was startling. Get away? I mean, where was I going to go? I had no money. How do you do that? So the next prayer was, God, I don't know how to walk away. So here's what I'm asking. If you will cause the fulcrum, I promise I will leave. Other than that, God, I don't know how to do this. And I'd been doing a lot of research. Man, you could check off boxes. Boom, 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 boom. And then he wanted me to lie to an association of churches for him to become the head of that. And I was like, you want me to lie? For you to become the head pastor over this? I said, no. No. You want to lie, go right ahead. If they ask me questions, I'm not lying. But how does a man who claims to be a man of God want me to lie? How does he want me to lie so he can get a job over all these pastors? He thought nothing of it. So I'd been doing a lot of research. I'd been doing a lot of praying. I'd been doing a lot of crying. I'd been doing a lot of being silent and watching him just act like nothing was going on. The kids watching me crying and sob. And one of my sons told me, you really hurt my feelings when you say if I could divorce him, I would, and I don't want to live. And I regret saying those things to him. I didn't realize my kids didn't see what was going on or known. I had stood between him and them. And there was times I would tell him, you may treat me like this, but you're not treating my kids this way. I didn't know. But on May 27th of 2015, we had gone to see a friend about finances, and we're driving back on Interstate 40. And he pulled one of his charming, passive-aggressive sentences to bring me back under his authority as his wife. And when he said it, I snapped. And I said, "You're a son of a bitch." I never uttered those words before, and let me tell you, I felt free all of a sudden. It felt good. He, on the other hand, had a sin depend on me. And he was delighted. I mean, he just said, "I'm fixing to pull over and tell you something." And I was like, "You go right ahead." I was feeling pretty good about that. And he pulled over on the side of the interstate, and he got in my face with his finger yelling at me. And he had never done that, and I'd never called him a son of a bitch, but he was in my face with his finger yelling at me, and it was like, this is it. And so I opened the door to the Suburban, I got my purse out of the floorboard, and I started walking down the interstate. It was between Clarksville and Alma. It was dusky dark. I was crying. Out of fear, out of relief. I think all the emotions were there except anything resembling happiness or joy. And I was like, "God, I need help. You know, I don't mind walking, but it's dusky dark. I could easily get killed, and so I need help." And when I looked up, there was a car down the side of the interstate, and the brake lights were already off. She was sitting there. And I didn't know who was in the car, but I looked at it and I said, "God, there's a car, and could be a serial killer, but it's better than what I've got, so I'm going to get in the car with them. I just wish I knew I could trust them." And the passenger door opened, and out got this woman, and she started walking towards me, and all I could tell in the dusk was she was not a teenager. And she's walking purposefully towards me, and when she gets to me, she just turns and slides an arm around my waist and gets a hand, and she's like, "Ma'am, do you want to ride?" And I said, "I do." And she said, "God said to stop and pick you up." And I said, "Well," I told him I needed help. And so she opens the back door to put me in. Her daughter's driving the car. And what I didn't know, but she knew, and why she was walking so purposefully, is he had parked the Suburban and he was running to get me. So when she's trying to put me in the back, he grabs me from behind, startled me. And he said, "We've had a fight, but she's fine. She's going with me." And I just looked up at him and I said, "I'm going to call the police." I was done. And he said, "All right, I'm going to call the police and tell them you're with somebody I don't know," which I thought was hilarious. And I said, "Call him." He let me go. She closed the door. She got in. She told her daughter to drive. And I called one of my sons. I knew his number by heart. And I'd left my phone in my car. He goes, "Mom, whose phone are you using?" And I told him what happened. He goes, "I'm going to get you a hotel room." I spent that night in a hotel praying, asking God what to do. And the next morning, my oldest son, who lived in New York, he was doing a job in Oklahoma at that time, but he called me, he'd heard about it, and he said, "Mom, the son who got you the hotel is going to pick you up. He's going to take you to lunch. There's nobody at home. You get in your car and you come to me." And so that's what happened. I got all my clothes, threw them in my 2 suitcases. I dumped out my junk jewelry into the bottom of a purse. I grabbed my journal, my Bible, and I got in the car, and I drove to Oklahoma. And the other interesting thing was I didn't have money, but the church that we had been pastoring, there was a man who owned an insurance company, and he, out of the blue, called and said, "Would you come work in my office for 2 weeks?" Which, of all the churches we had pastored at, that had never happened. And I said, "Sure." And the morning I woke up in that hotel room, he texted me and he said, "Detra, your paycheck's ready." So I had some money to put gas in my car, and I made it to Oklahoma. And I was there for 3 weeks with him. And he said, "Mom, I'm taking you to New York." I was shattered. In that world, what I did, I was a failure. I'm accused of, I destroyed the family, all of these things, which on one hand could be technically true, on another hand could not be technically true. So I got brought to New York. I don't know if anybody has ever seen that old Pace Picante commercial, the Cowboys Around the Fire, you know, where they say, New York City. That's what I thought of New York.
I got you.
I'd never been to New York, but that's what I thought of New York. You know, it's just Sin City. They get on stage and do things that, you know, aren't right. And I would never have come to New York.
Did your son ever tell you why? Why did he choose New York from Oklahoma?
Well, he lived in New York.
Understood.
Him and his wife lived in Brooklyn. He was just in Oklahoma doing a job. So that's where he lived. So June the 20th of 2015, we pull into New York and they lived in Brooklyn. And I'm not trying to be ugly about New York, but my first week here, I just thought people were crazy.
We are.
Yeah, I had never seen anything like it. Just the amount of people that get spit out of subway tunnels, you know? And one day I spent 20 minutes standing on the corner, which, by the way, I've learned it's not good to stand on the corners of New York. And just observed thousands of people coming from J Street Metro and Borough Hall. And, you know, the sea of people, they're almost touching shoulders, but not quite. They never look at each other. No one's saying, hi, how are you doing? Carrying just 2 bags of groceries because you can't drive your car and go pull them in this huge parking lot and load the trunk. It was crazy to me. And my first few days, you know, I wasn't planning on staying here. I was just like, this is crazy, and people have to be crazy to live here. It turns out that I ended up staying in New York. I was with my son and his wife for a year. And they moved with the transfer of a job to a state far away. And I told them, I said, I'm going to stay here. I said, it may get pretty rough. Now, I have 2 sons who talk to me out of the 7. And 5 of my children have decided that I'm too sinful, you know. They don't want to talk to me. And while it rips my heart out, I raised them in that world, you know, that's on me. And I have 12 grandchildren I'm not allowed to see or talk to. And they're beautiful. I'm hoping one day they grow up and want to come find the crazy grandma. But my other son that talks to me lives in Arkansas. He goes, Mom, why don't you come live with me? And he wasn't married, and he had a 2-bedroom apartment. He takes excellent care of me. And it would have been, you know, a pretty good deal, except he lived in the city where I was born. We moved away, but I went back there to college, to this little tiny Christian college. I got married there. We moved away, then we moved back. I had a baby there. Both my dad and my father-in-law had pastored there. He had pastored there. It would have been emotional suicide. Emotional suicide. So after my son and his wife left, I made it a couple of months with the help of a friend who rented me a room really cheap. But they had family coming in. And I went to the de Blasio's domestic violence unit. I had asked all kinds of questions. They said, you know, we can get you a homeless apartment, but you have to go through the city shelter. And I was like, how long would that take? And they said, well, we don't know. And I kind of did some research. Could be up to 2 years. And in the city shelter, you're just guaranteed to be raped and everything stolen. So I began checking with private shelters. Now, I was a Starbucks barista at this time, and 3 of the shelters refused me because I had to be at work at 5 in the morning. And they said, oh, no, you have to give up your job. And I'm like, you do know I'm going to be homeless. It didn't matter. It was crazy. But I made a connection with Josiah, who is now the CEO of City Relief. And he graciously listened to my plight. And somehow he made it possible that I could be in a private shelter. I had a couple of friends who generously agreed to keep, you know, my clothes, and I had a few little possessions after a year in New York, because all I was allowed was a suitcase and my purse. So on October 31st of 2016, I got in a taxi and I gave an address, and when I got out, I walked into a homeless shelter. There were 30 of us women in one room. There were 15 sets of bunk beds. There were 2 showers. And you're locked in like prison at night. You're herded in a straight line like cattle. It was the lowest part of my life. All right.
Camera A, Mark.
Detra, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Just your raw storytelling. I just can imagine how many people are going to watch this and see strength, see resilience in your story. We left off in 2016.
Yep.
New York City, Arkansas girl in the big city, taking it by storm. But I know your journey is not what you expected from shelters and all the things you had to go through. So let's go back in that moment. I know it's tough, but let's get back in that moment. 2016, talk to us.
All right, well, October 31st of 2016, I entered a homeless shelter. And when I walked in, someone walked up smiling and said, "Oh my goodness, a new volunteer. We're so glad to have you." And I said, "No, I live here." And I watched them, try to figure out how to get out of the hole they just dug. And I tried to help them because that's who I am. I said, "It's okay. Don't worry about it." But every night for 2 weeks when I'd walk in, "Oh my goodness, a new volunteer." Because they had volunteers who changed out. And I'd say, "No, I live here." Like I said, there were 30 women of us in that room, 2 showers. Check-in was at 4 every afternoon. You had to be out during the day. And one of the very big perks that I had personally, because I had a job, was I got to leave my suitcase in this huge cage that they had at the end of the room. The other women had to take their suitcases with them every morning and bring them back at night. I don't know what I would have done if I had to roll my suitcase with me everywhere, because I opened at Starbucks at 5 o'clock in the morning, but it was in Brooklyn. And the shelter was in Chinatown in Manhattan. So I would get up, a guard would wake me up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And that was another string that got pulled for me. And I was the only one who did that. The rest of the women had to get up at their regular time. So even my 2 days that I was off, I didn't tell them I was off. I would just get up at 3 in the morning because I heard the nightmare stories of what would happen when they would wake all the women up and the fights in the bathroom. Now, we got all of our showers at night, but there was still, the scramble for the commodes and the sinks and getting out and getting your bag and your suitcase. And I just didn't want to be there with all the fighting. So I would go to Starbucks. I would be there when they opened, and I would, now my supervisor knew I was in a homeless shelter, but my customers didn't. And I had a journal that I would be writing in. And they just thought I was writing a book, And they would say, one day I want to read your book. And I would say, okay. But I knew in a couple of weeks of being there that I was going to have to write because the emotional strain was horrendous. I had run a ministry for the homeless for 4 years in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And it was hard to be in that position. So I would write. And I wrote about 300 pages, of the emotional duress, trauma, how I ended up there, but also figuring out how to learn. And while I was in the homeless shelter, I learned 2 big things that were pivotal. Because, it's one thing to go through trauma. It's another thing to get out of trauma. It's one thing to have shit done to you. It's another thing to learn how the shit doesn't have to be on you or cause an odor. And one day when I was cleaning off tables at Starbucks, one of my customers was like, "Hey, Detra, do you live in the area?" And I said, "Well, I lived in Carroll Gardens with my son and his wife for a year." And her next question was, "Well, where do you live now?" Now, I get asked almost every day in New York, "Where are you from?" But nobody ever asked me, where do you live? And I did not have an answer ready. I'd only been in the shelter probably 2 weeks. So it was really odd that she asked me that then. I'd been working at Starbucks for, about 8 months. And I said, well, I live in a homeless shelter. She's like, you do not. And I said, I do. And she said, right now at this moment, you're in a homeless shelter? And I said, yes. She goes, I got to get out of here before I start crying. And I was like, don't cry. It's just part of my journey. But she ran out of the Starbucks crying. What was such a revelation to me was as I was wiping off tables and I have just revealed this, I realized that I wasn't embarrassed. And I was quite shocked at that. How is that not embarrassing to me? And again, it was like a light bulb moment, and I realized that address did not define who I was or was going to be. Yeah, it was the reality. And in New York, homelessness has a stench. It does. It really does. And I was living it. But I knew, I don't know how I knew, but somehow down to my 10 red piggies, and I keep them painted dark red, I knew that didn't define me. And the next thought that entered my brain was, then why are you letting the men who raped and molested you as a little girl, the man you married, your 5 children, your parents, and that whole world define you? I don't know if I ever would have been able to see that visual if I wasn't living the reality of being homeless. I mean, intellectually, I could say, oh yeah, I'm not supposed to let things define me, but in my being, I was letting things define me, and I was letting all the rest of that define me. And I remember being in Starbucks, and again, I'm very visual, and I realized that every morning when I was awakened in the homeless shelter, and I'd be the only one up, and by the way, if you're ever in a homeless shelter and you get up at 3 a.m, do not push the hand dryer. You can get screamed at, which I don't know why she was screaming, because that's noise too, but you're very, very quiet, So I would get up at 3, go to the bathroom, they would unlock the cage, I would get out my toiletries, put in my pajamas, get dressed, do my makeup, comb my hair. But I realized every morning when I got done with that, I was reaching for this invisible, thick, black coat of guilt and shame. And I just wrapped it around me. This dark, thick thing. And I'd been wrapped in that since I was 2 years old. And things started happening in my life that weren't nice. And I remember just kind of visually letting it go and fall on the floor at Starbucks, thinking somebody will snatch it up. Because that's what we do, isn't it? We want to hide those things in our lives. And I knew it was going to be scary, and when you emotionally drop that kind of things, the air feels chilly to you. But it was like all of a sudden I could see the lies I had been fed, as baby food when I was young, that had now become ribeye and baked potato. I thought it was what I needed to sustain me, these lies, and I realized I didn't need them. So I learned that while living in the homeless shelter. The second big thing that I learned is that I had an addiction. Now, every night they had chapel except Sunday night. And if you would go to chapel, you could go outside for 10 minutes. I went to chapel because that 10 minutes of fresh air meant everything. Now, what I didn't know was it was a cigarette break. But once I figured that out, I was going to start smoking cigarettes if I needed to. But I asked, do I have to smoke a cigarette? And they're like, no, you don't have to. But I could go outside for 10 minutes before I was locked in. And that air was just everything to me. So on Sunday nights, there was no chapel, but they had AA meetings. And so I would go to the AA meetings. Now, I felt bad going and sitting in this very vulnerable time in people's lives, you know? But I just needed the air. And so week after week, I would go and they would have a speaker who would share their story. And we would sit in a circle and they would go around the circle. You know, everybody would say, hi, my name is Detra. I'm an addict or I'm an alcoholic. And they would say a few words and they would continue around the circle. And so when they would get to me, you know, I would just say, you know, and do this. Because I didn't want to be a fake. You know, I just needed the air. Well, one week we couldn't meet in our normal place and we had to meet downstairs in the dining hall, which meant we weren't in a circle. We're just haphazardly around, you know, picnic tables. And the speaker that night was, I don't know, he was really good, very poignant. So when it comes time to go around what's not a circle, everybody talks except me. I don't know what happened that night to me, but it was a moment when I realized something that would change everything for me. And so since I'm the only one who hasn't spoken, everyone's looking at me, and I stood up and I said, well, I have a confession to make. You know, I've been coming because I want to go outside and breathe air. And I am sorry to crash, you know, your AA meeting. But I've learned something, you know, all these weeks that I've been coming, and that is I'm just as addicted as you are. But my addiction is to being good. You know, I had to be good to please my dad, who was a pastor. I had to be good to please the people in the church so I would have a good reputation. I had to be good to please the man I was married to so that God would bless me and protect me. I had to be good as a pastor's wife. I had to be good as a homeschool mom. And I said, that's why I'm in a homeless shelter. Because I was so addicted to being good, I stayed 34 years in a marriage where I knew I needed out in 3 weeks. And I knew, you know, I could never accomplish being good. It was time to live. I was only in the homeless shelter 4 months. Now, if I had known that when I went in, I would have thought I can do anything for 4 months. But when the day you walk in, it's infinity. And I didn't know till the 4 days before I got out that I was going to get out. But I did get out. Because another Starbucks customer asked me where I lived. And I told her. She was horrified. Her and her husband met with us the next day. He's like, can I ask questions? I said, sure, ask questions. And he asked personal and financial. And when he was done, he was like, we just know you as our barista, Detra, but we love you and we cannot imagine what you're going through. So for the next 6 months, we're going to give you this many hundreds of dollars every month. And we just want to invest in you. We don't ever want to be paid back. That's a miracle. My drummer, my band, I had only done one show at that time, had bought an apartment in Harlem. And he knew I was in a shelter. He said, come out and look. So I went out there to see about renting a room. And I did. And I moved to 134th and Broadway. I rented a room for 2.5 years. And I worked in Brooklyn. I had to be there at 5 o'clock in the morning, so that meant I had to get up at 2 in the morning. I started working 4 jobs 7 days a week, anything to stay out of the shelter. The one train wasn't running at that time. They were working on it at night, so I had to walk 7/10 of a mile to the A train. And my first night of walking to the A train at 3:20 in the morning, well, actually I started walking at 3. I'd get to the train about 3:20. I was scared, very scared. Within a couple of nights, this man who was walking towards me, we never stopped walking. It was March, and he was like, where's your coat? And I said, it's at the house. He said, go get it. I said, I don't have time. He said, you're going to get pneumonia. I said, I'll be fine. A couple nights later, he pops up on his stoop, and he goes, can't your husband help you with the weather? And I said, I left him months ago. So he started walking with me. I called him the pop-up man. I never knew where he was going to pop up. And one day he's walking with me and he said, you know, if you give me your number, I can help you with the weather. And I stopped and I said, what else are you going to do with my number? He said, well, I might call you. I said, I'll think about it.
That was smooth. I'm sorry, teacher. That was smooth.
Huh?
That was smooth. I got to give it to him.
That was smooth?
Yeah, that was smooth. That's
it was
what he
smooth.
said. Yeah.
It was smooth. And
the
see,
young
I
kids
wasn't.
call it Riz now.
I wasn't up on smoothness. But I thought about it and I thought, you know, he's the alpha male of that neighborhood. I'll give him my number. So I'm going to call him Teacup.
Okay, we'll do it.
So I gave Teacup my number. So Teacup would just, it was so weird. He would pop up on this stoop. He would pop up on the sidewalk. He would pop up here. And so he would talk to me. And one time I'd come by in the morning at 3:20 and he's grilling hamburgers and hot dogs on the sidewalk. And there's all these people. And I stopped and I said, you're having a barbecue at 3:20 in the morning? Yeah, we're just having homecoming. I thought, man, these high schools, they really go all night, you know? And one night...
That's such a Southern answer. That's such a Southern...
And then one night he walked with me and he goes, hey, babe, I like you a lot to tell you this, but, you know, I'm a drug dealer and a thug. Well, I knew what a drug dealer was. I didn't know what a thug was. And I was like, so what's a thug? He said, I don't take nothing off nobody. I said, okay. But he became my protector. He introduced me to all these guys, which at that time I didn't know when he did. He's like, this is her. You take care of her. Nobody messes with her. One night I called him. I was walking. There was something going on in the neighborhood. It scared me. He answered the phone. Babe, somebody messing with you? And I said, I'm scared. Where are you? For a year and 8 months, Teacup took care of me. I loved that man in my life. He and I had two totally different lives. We became friends. Still friends to this day, still message occasionally. But it gave me a sense of being taken care of at a time when I didn't know what was going to happen to me being in a homeless shelter. I didn't know what was going to happen to me working 4 jobs 7 days a week. I didn't know what was going to happen to me, if I was going to make it, if I was going to have to go back to the shelter. And this man became a friend. I finally was able to get a full-time job and moved to 141st and Broadway. And I thought maybe I'd had it made, you know, things were going to go good, but then January happened and March happened and it was 2020 and the city shut down. And I'm working from home. And the city shut down on Tuesday and I woke up Saturday deathly ill. Almost died. My doctor ordered me to the hospital twice and I told her I'd die at home. And so she assigned me to death. I was so ill with very high fever for 9 days. And finally got to where I was not running any fever after 3 weeks and decided that I would, you know, go to Broadway, which was 3 doors down, less than half a block, and just sit on a bench and get some fresh air. Even though I was so much better, I had no idea how weak I was. And I made it down 1 flight of stairs and turned and blacked out enough to land on my head at the bottom of the next flight. Had a lot of stitches. I had a 9-month concussion. It was hard. I was working from home. But in June, when the sidewalk cafes opened, I started walking to the corner of 141st and Broadway, and right on the corner was the Harlem Cigar Room. And then right next to it was the Harlem Wine Room. And so I would go every Tuesday and Friday, and I would sit at this round table with facing, you know, the restaurant. I would get a glass of wine and some fries. You know, you had to order something to eat then. And I would listen to these men. You know, their cigar smoke sounded good, their laughter, their music. I think when I fell in love with them was one night when they were playing My Girl came on and they got up and started dancing. After 5 or 6 weeks, they started chatting with me. You know, you look lovely tonight. Thank you. My oldest son, who had brought me to New York, called and he goes, Mom, I'm keeping up with crime in Harlem. It's going up. And he said, I'm worried. He's not a worrier. And I said, well, I'm too weak. I have no money. I can't move. Now, I don't go to church anymore. I don't have any love for boxed religion anymore, but I'm very much a praying woman. And so I just said, God, I need to know if you can protect me in Harlem. And if you can, I need you to let me know in a way he's comfortable, because he's been through enough with me, So after them chatting with me, saying nice things, I went down early one day with my work computer, and there was only one man outside because it was early. I knew his name. I knew like 12 by name by now. And he said, "We want to offer you protection." And I said, "Well, I'm a woman that takes that seriously." And he said, "Well, we take care of family, and you're now our family." And I said, "Well, in my mind, I call y'all the Harlem Mafia." He said, "We're FBI, state police, and security. If anybody messes with you, let us know." So I called my son, who was a federal agent at the time, and I said, "Fly up here this weekend. I'm going to smoke cigars. I'm accepting the protection, and I want you with me. I want y'all to talk about what y'all do for a living. I want them to know I have a son. I'm not a flirt." So he flew up there. I smoked a cigar Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and I introduced him to all the guys I knew by name, and every one of those men said, "We got your mama. You don't worry about her. Nothing's going to happen to her." And my son was like, "You know what? Those are some of the most legit men I've ever met." And he started paying for my membership. And so I've been a member of the Harlem Cigar Room since 2020. The license plate on my truck says Harlem Girl. They taught me how to be sassy. They taught me how to cuss. They taught me how to drink. I'd never had a taste of alcohol before I got to New York. If somebody got out of line, they handled it. I call them my Harlem Loves. In 21, when I'd been out of the shelter for 5 years, I get a message from one of the volunteers, and she said, "Detra, have you ever read anything about Humans of New York?" And I said, "Oh, I've read some of the stories. They're beautiful." She said, "Well, I just got through talking to the producer and author, Brandon Stanton, and he might want to feature you. Are you okay with that?" And I was like, "Sure." So in a few days, he called me, set up an interview, and I asked the owner of the Harlem Cigar Room, I said, "Hey, can we do the interview here?" I said, "This guy's going to be taking some pictures, and I want to be smoking him a cigar out in front of the Harlem Cigar Room just to say thank you," because I had no way to thank these guys for what they had done for me. And he said, "Sure." I said, "This guy has millions of followers, tens of millions of followers, and people will come find this place, and I want to show my appreciation." So Brandon came, and he said, "Detra, I either do a one-page or I do a series." And about 15 minutes into the interview, he leaned over and he didn't get my hands, he got my wrist, and he said, "This is one of the most incredible stories I've ever heard, and we'll do a whole series." So on June the 9th of 22, he released this 15-chapter series, and in all of them, I'm smoking a cigar in Harlem. Well, while I thought I was saying thank you to these guys, the world saw the cigar as something of hope and resilience. So people started flying in from all over the United States. I did 10 shows that year. I have a 5-piece band, and my shows are narrative and cover songs and originals, and I take you on the journey wherever I am at the moment. So I did 10 shows. We had people from New Zealand, Hawaii, all over the United States, and they wanted to smoke cigars. So many people were coming to smoke cigars. I asked the owner, I said, "What do you think about me doing my own line of cigars?" And he said, "Well, I think you should." So we flew to the Dominican Republic. I spent 6 days designing my line of cigars. Also, there was a fundraiser with the story. And he said, "Detra's worked hard her whole life and she's never been paid. Let's help Detra breathe." That was the word he used, breathe. From all over the globe, money came. $5, $10, $25, $50, $100, $5,000. The world sent over $600,000 that was tax-free. I wanted to invest most of the money, and so I bought a house about an hour north of Harlem. I was ready for trees, for nature. I was ready to breathe a little bit. And when I started telling my Harlem guys that I was going to buy a house and move, they got mad at me. "What are you doing?" I said, "Guys, I'm used to nature." And I said, "Don't worry. When I get my house ready, I want y'all to come up for a barbecue." Last May was my birthday, and I told the guys, "I want you to come to my house for a barbecue." So my birthday was coming, and I wanted the guys to come up to my house. I wanted them to see my house. I wanted them to know that even though I wasn't at the Harlem Cigar Room 5 nights out of 7, that they were still my family and that I needed them. And so I had to go to Harlem 3 times and kind of threaten them, you know. Guys, this is important. This is my birthday. This is the 9-year anniversary. Yeah. I went back down. Guys, do you hear me? May 25th, this is it. You're coming to my house. 3rd time. Guys, you gotta come. So they were trying to work up plans, you know. First they were gonna rent a party bus, and that was too much. Then they were gonna rent a van, and they went the day, and they finally just piled in cars. 18 of them came. By this time, there is a lounge up there by my house. In fact, when I went up to look for houses, I went to a bar. I said, is there a cigar lounge up here? And they said no. And I said, God, I don't know how you're going to do it, but I need a lounge. I closed on my house in January, and a lounge opened 4 minutes from my house in March. So I told the guys, hey, come to my house. We had 3 grills going. We had all kinds of food. Then we're going to go over to the lounge, and we're going to smoke. We had poker. We had a fire pit. 18 of them piled in cars and came to my house. Between them and the other lounge, we had 47 people. I'd never thrown a party for myself. It was one of the best days of my life. Both of my sons who talked to me were there. I mean, it was perfection. Everybody that was important to me was there. I still kind of worried about the Harlem guys, but when I got a phone call the next day and said, hey, Detra, that was dope. Can we come back? And I've learned dope's a good word in some ways. And so I said, sure. I have taken 14 of my guys from where I am now to Harlem twice to smoke. Harlem has come up there twice to smoke. It's important to me that people in my world that I think are the most beautiful people know each other. My life has changed. And every once in a while I think, if someone had told me 10 years ago that I would be living in New York, that I would have had tasted alcohol, that I would even be smoking a cigar, that I would have my own line of cigars, that my vanity tag on my truck reads Harlem Girl, that I would have paid cash for a house, and I don't have to worry about being homeless again, that I would be surrounded by the most beautiful love, I would have told them there's medicine for that. Because I'm not supposed to be doing all these things, you know? What I have found is my old life, everything was cut and dried. It was a this or this. It was black or white. Now my life is filled with so much color, brilliant color, vivid colors. Every color of the rainbow is the most beautiful thing I've ever known. I'm free, I'm happy. Is there a lot to learn living by myself as a woman and figuring out life? There is. I still have a lot to go. In the meantime, I'm not worried about the next step I take because I'm surrounded by people who are cheering me on, who tell me we're here if you need us. But I also know that no matter what, God loves me, protects me, and blesses me, even though I'm not fitting into that little box that I was born into and told that I could never get out of. It's been an amazing journey, and I'm very happy to have taken it and to have met you, John.
Detra, I'm happy I've met you too, and I'm thankful for our monthly smokes at the Harlem Cigar Lounge. I'm thankful for all the wisdom, you know, as a mom, and all the knowledge that you do give me. And I think it would be a disgrace to the audience if they didn't hear your lovely voice. Now, I don't have a studio, a sound system, or a beat, but I've heard you sing and at Mario's, at wonderful places. I've got to meet your band, and I've been very honored. But if you can give me an acapella so the audience can hear your voice and we can end this story the right way.
All right. Well, you know, I've done over 20 shows now, and I love using music to let out pain, you know, in a palatable way. But
yes, ma'am.
If I was told I could only sing one song, and I could not have any instruments, any band, and these were the only words I would ever be able to say, this is what I would say. My Father is omnipotent, and that you can't deny, a God of might and miracles. It's written in the sky. It took a miracle to put the world in space. It took a miracle to hang each star in place. But when he saved my soul, cleansed and made me whole, it took a miracle of love and amazing grace. How sweet the sound, it saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and it's grace that will lead me home. But when he saved my soul, cleansed and made me whole, it took a miracle of love and grace.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's Detra.